There is a Venn diagram between people who love a good Renaissance festival or like a Viking, a chance to cosplay as a Viking, really. And people who are really into the exact kind of folk magic that you teach on. And that Venn diagram is also a circle. And I'm including myself.
And it's me.
And it's also me, and it's also low-key Key. You know, Key may not admit it, but I've seen his getup for when he goes to a Halung concert.
Yeah, I'm in
Yeah,
the circle.
you're in the circle, you have long blonde hair and a beard, okay? You are absolutely rocking it. And the only thing that's missing is you need one of those horns. Like not the nice drinking
Mhm.
horns that you can get on Etsy. I'm talking like the ones that you could take to Starbucks. Like you know, you've seen
The
those, right?
Amazon.
The Amazon ones. Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah,
Amazon
exactly.
plastic horns, yes. Oh my God.
My first time at a Halen concert, there was this couple that sat in front of me. First of all, everyone was dressed like Ragnar Lothbrok from the Vikings TV show on History Channel, and anyone who wasn't dressed like him was dressed like one of the other characters on the show, um, unintentionally or otherwise. And there's this couple that was sitting in front of me. They bought beers. Or like no, excuse me, they brought mead or no or ale at the concession stand, which is overpriced as fuck. And they sat in front of me because this was in like a concert hall, which was kind of weird. Like we couldn't like stand up and like dance, which is whatever. But anyway, and they took out their Amazon drinking horns, cracked open their beverages, and poured them inside, and then
Oh
they
my God.
they clicked the Amazon horns together and said "Skål." And
No.
I love it.
Keith's here for it. Albert's 50% of the way here for it. I'm in a mercurial place. Schrodinger's here for it. Like sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not, depending on who is viewing. There's a little bit of quantum mechanics going on. God bless. There is something about like the people who are like, oh, quantum physics will explain magic, and like those guys, and like the psilocybin, like the mushrooms, you know. Which as a mushroom girly, I also am. This is not me making fun of anyone. This is also me totally talking about like I absolutely read this stuff. And then there's the Renaissance Fair people and the Amazon drinking horn girlies, which I'm all for, and I love that.
Gotta offer the machine elves some mead
Yes,
in
yes, out of the drinking
the drinking
horn.
horn of art. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
But that is where you get the best merch. Unquestionably. It is where you get like that one like piece that you're like, oh, I know exactly which spirit would want this. I'm gonna find this cheeky and cute.
Also really good Liber Spiritums and all that.
Yes,
And the
because
bookbinders.
because there's always the steampunk belly dancer lady. There's always the three guys who are like blacksmiths in quotation marks. And then there's the person who makes the amazing handbound journals, and then the person who sells possibly handbound journals that have gemstones in them, possibly not handbound, possibly bought from any other New Age store that they're rebranding. But don't worry, this one has Odin on it.
Ah.
Oh no.
Oh my
Albert.
God.
I love it. Albert's shaking his head. All right. Let's just go to music.
Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Svinga and Berserker Key.
It's actually a Björk key. We asked Albert. I was like, "What's a good beat? Like, tell like something that would work really well. Like, give us a nice, word stave, if you will. Ensorcel us with your knowledge of this language." And he was like, "Bjork."
It's Björn,
It's Bjork.
absolutely.
Yes. So, do you know who that is, Key?
I'm aware of Bjork.
Okay,
Um,
this is now a running gag. Like we of like a pop star. Do you know her? Lady Gaga.
I'm sure I've heard Bjork at some point.
How do you know all music? How do you know, like, oh, here's this all-female Japanese thrash metal band from the 80s? Like, how do you know every kind of music from every culture? This is only slightly exaggerating. This hyperbole is only a little bit of hyperbole. But then you know zero pop.
I don't know, it just kind of worked out that way.
Right. Okay. I love it. I love it. You are an audiophile that likes all the audio except for everything that is mainstream because you're too hipster.
I think part of it as well is just I'm not on like anything, so I'm like 10 years disjointed from popular culture.
That is true. It took us a lot of effort. It was like you, me, Salt, and Mohegan in a room. And it was just all of us being like, make an Instagram. If you want to do this magic thing, you have to do this. Please let us tag you in things. So let us promote the fact that you were an amazing diviner and sorcerer and so on and so forth. And we were just talking before we hit record about like how all three of us are kind of like awkward, including Salt actually. He's not on this episode, but like he is 100% in this category of people who are just like a little bit like uncomfortable around social media. Like we still don't really understand how to navigate that in like not necessarily in like a way that works for us because like we get that like we understand our presence, but it's just more that like it's not something we take very seriously. And
Mhm.
so like it took a while to get you on it, which I appreciate very much that you did. But yeah, you are quite behind, but that's okay. One thing you're not behind on is incredibly specific knowledge about your 10,000 hobbies and niche skills. So, we love a polymath. We love a berserker. We love that you tranced out on the dance floor to a Heilung and almost got into a fight with several people. You had to like dodge in slow motion their Amazon horn like drinking cups
Yeah.
as they were trying to like gouge you out. Yeah.
Yeah, those spikes when they start flying are a bit dangerous, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're like Neo in the Matrix, like slow motion.
Mhm. Hammer if your plays in the background.
Yes, yes, exactly. Love it.
But speaking of the drinking horn, to do a little hospitality and housekeeping,
Mhm.
remember to check us out on twitter.com/frightful howls and patreon.com/the frightful howls. We have a bonus episode every month curated by and for our patrons. We have a Discord server that is popping off, and I would love to see everyone there. We have Salt's Fantastic Almanac, a monthly live occult book club where we discuss a text of your choosing, show notes for every episode, and more. So remember to give us a like, rating, and review on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever it is you're listening to us. It helps us to fight the evil and drinking hornless demiurge of the algorithm.
Maidenless demiurge, drinking hornless, no wenches at the Renaissance Fair, no, belly dancing, steampunk enjoying, leather journal having ladies. I fucking love all those things. Like shout outs to how awesome. Like those are the people that carry the festival. I'm sorry, I have to
Mhm.
interrupt, but like that, like those are the exact women who it is their sweat that makes that shit work. Like they are badasses, and I fucking love belly dancing, and I fucking love a good corset. So shout outs to all those people.
Shout out to those who have a tactical tea set on their belt.
Yes, yes. Listen, we were just talking about how the three of us need fits for a steampunk festival one day. And I was saying, I just want to have a corset and one of those tiny little top hats, like that clips into your hair, that can contain the part of my brain that leaks at all times, that I cover up with my fringe.
Mhm.
And then Key needs to be in like a nice waistcoat, some kind of brassy color, with like a pocket watch. that is broken for photomakers, and then another pocket watch. That is massive.
Massive.
And then another pocket watch that actually tells the time. That is a bunch of like sigils in, and that like he just consults it, and he has like a bunch of belts on him, but they're like not on his waist. They're like on his legs, at his arms, like holding his like sleeves up, and it's like his new hyperfixation is belts instead of ropes. And like that just becomes our vibe. And then Albert needs to be the guy who over explains to everyone, no, it's not a Viking tattoo. This is actually not a Viking tattoo. No, you heard me right. It's not Viking.
I think I would just give up. I'd be the belly dancer.
You'd be the great. Okay, I would
I
volunteer.
don't think I have the energy to continuously tell people it's not a Viking symbol.
Okay, that's fair. I wanted to volunteer as the belly dancer, but I agree it should be you. Because then you don't have to talk about the Viking tattoos.
You just have to move them and hypnotize people with
Oh!
whatever the patterns are.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. As they undulate on your body, like everyone who showed up to the festival already pre-gaming it with shrooms is like, oh my god, like they're exactly completely
Oh my
fixated.
God.
And then I am the potion lady. I'm the one who has like the like different colored bottles and bobs that like are on pendants, that little like mana potion bottles that people sell. You know what I'm talking about?
Ooh.
Like, yeah, exactly. Like, this one's red. This is my health potion. The yellow one is my stamina potion. And like, I just like have them on me and my belt and my corset, everything. And I'm just jingle jangling. And I have like light fixtures in places that you don't need light. But like, I just like rolled through a bunch of like Christmas lights, and they're like now beautifully interwoven with like an ivy leaf pattern on my corset, and my little top hat that is clipped into my bangs is containing my brain. That I have a green potion that helps me sustain. Okay, great. Sorry. We at the Renaissance Festival, that is the Frightful House you may hear, we also have some services.
That we do.
Love
Much as the
I love a smooth transition.
much as readings and divinations are usually offered in a booth somewhere at this Renaissance Festival, I happen to offer readings as well as personalized coaching in magic and mediumship, sorcery for hire, and custom talismans, oils, and tools. Sfinga offers Balkan Thaumamancy readings.
Yes, they're back. It is now September that you're listening to this, so they are back on the menu. So you can get a B reading from me. You can get a cartomancy reading from Key, in which he will peruse his steampunk tarot deck. To tell you- It's actually playing cards, but a girl can dream. I dream that the spades on your deck have like years.
Mhm. I've been reading a lot of Lenormand recently for
Oh, okay.
clients.
Oh my God, the lady and the gentleman. We met them at the Speaktown Festival. We were there. We were there. Yeah.
Legit. There is actually a really cool steampunk kind of Lenormand deck that recently came out through someone, and I'm like,
Mhm. Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, oh my God, the letter with like those like wax seals that you can get at every like new pagan store.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
But at that, Salt offers anything and everything astrological, be it horary, electional, or natal, as well as incense watching divination.
In the Steampunk Festival, that is Frightful House you may hear, Salt is actually the galvanist guy. With
Yeah.
like the orb of like lightning. Yeah, that's him. And he's like, come
He's-
on, come all. Yeah.
He's Hockley maxing.
He is
He knows what's
100%.
up.
He is Hockley maxing. He is one day he will own all of the Hockleys, I'm sure.
Mhm.
In their first editions. That is a goal, I'm sure. He is 100% DeLawrence maxing.
True. Yeah. Oh man. But if you don't run into us at the Steampunk Festival, you can hit us up on social media. Sfinga is at Dragon Cunning, Salt is at Salt C and C, and I am at barnowl.key. And last but very much so not least, we have a guest today.
We do indeed. It is Albert Björn. And because he is very British, I will introduce his plugs. Please give him a follow on Instagram at Sussex_Peller. Pellercrafts.com is the website. He has some awesome courses. He's currently right now in the last legs of his Northern Folk Magic 2-month course, but there will be, from what I understand, another tour of it at some point in the future.
Yes.
Amazing. And he's got 2 fantastic books, both published by Crosscrow Books, Icelandic Folk Magic, most recently, and also Icelandic Plant Magic. I have both, and they are fantastic. And he also has a Patreon, patreon.com/SussexFeller. So, Albert, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It is our pleasure. You guys know one of our rules for the podcast is guests must be personal friends. And Albert and I have been following each other for a very long time, but like this year, we really became friends, having met at the Virtus Genie Symposium, which was an absolute blast. Your presentation was phenomenal. And I've heard so many things, glowing reviews from the workshop that you did on staves and plant magic and so on. So it was just super exciting to be able to like spend so many hours just chit-chatting about like what does it mean to like go to a different country, to learn a new language, to understand animism, not just as this nebulous idea that like yes, spirits exist. Okay, we're all magicians and witches, we get that. Like we're here for it. But like what's next? What does it mean about the relationality of these pacts? What does it mean that like they don't have to necessarily like you? What does it mean that you have now entered into a space in which you are introducing yourself and essentially having this immigration experience every time you make a new pact and make a new agreement. So like that was really fun and exciting, and like we vibed on so much. So it's exciting to have you on to talk about really your journey and your philosophies towards what does it mean to have undergone this immense training that you have in Iceland. And I think it's we'll give you some space, obviously, for those who don't know you to introduce yourself a bit more thoroughly. But I just wanted to kind of flag something that I think is really fascinating, which is we had on as our first ever guest Gary Noriyuki, who spoke about balancing traditions and spoke about like what does it actually mean to be in multiple streams of magic, and to learn a language and to essentially like immerse yourself into a new culture. And what does it mean to balance all these things? But what I'm excited about today, especially, is talking about what does it mean to kind of like balance in some ways, like not just this like one thing. Obviously, we all practice multiple things, but what does it mean to prioritize and the immersion into one particular cultural system while still having like your own cultural background too? So like in my case being Serbian, but then also learning something Brazilian, in Key's case being American and, having this like Dutch Protestant and Catholic background as well, but then also learning something Brazilian as well as those other things that he and I can't necessarily talk about that we share in public. And then, in Albert's case, coming from England and then also immersing himself in like moving to Iceland, living there for many years and learning the language. And in Salt's case, being also British, but like learning something Chinese. So I think that's really exciting as a way to kind of grapple with the question of community of spirits as well as the community of interlocutors, right? Like mentors in spirit, mentors that are physical and living, and mentors of books, right? Like the authors that mentor us through the fact that we read and translate their works. So thank you so much for being on. Maybe you want to tell folks a little bit about yourself, what your background is. We've teased a little bit already. Where did you get your start, and how did you end up in Iceland?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Sussex, as my Instagram name states very clearly for people who often get confused. I I started really. I feel like I was quite lucky because I come from a Catholic family, but they're not crazy into Catholicism. So I got like quite a good amount of biblical stuff down at an early age, which was trauma for a moment, but now I've really come to terms with, and it's actually really helped me with certain aspects of my practice now. But going from that then to luckily like one of my first sort of, I mean, really one of my first sort of teachers in anything magic related was the herbalist who ran the shop that I was doing like a work experience for. So I was maybe like 14, and I had like a week-long experience like working in the shop, but instead of actually working in the shop, I was just being taught about all the herbs. And she's a family friend who runs it, so I was in contact with her after that still, and she's still alive, so still now. And I got into plant stuff, which then for a while I sort of put aside when I was looking more at runes and getting more into really more sort of folkloric stuff, like reading. I mean, originally not folkloric in terms of witchy things, of coming from a more Dorian Valiente and Scott Cunningham sort of book angle. And then in Sussex, particularly, Dorian Valiente wrote quite a bit on Sussex, and she drew, although a more of a Wiccan stream, like she drew more. But she drew quite a bit from folklore too, so that was quite nice to have that be the in to the folkloric side of things, and then really reading about like Sussex witches and adding this other sort of more folklore inspired level to what I was doing there. And then I was quite lucky because I met when I was working at a shop. A guy came in to buy some shoes, and then we were talking, and he was the guy who first sort of was teaching me the runes. It's like we got talking after that, and like we're still in contact now. He became a teacher of mine, so I was learning about the runes, and it was all more sort of, it was more not new agey, but more sort of new age informed partially by folklore. And then the more I was learning about it, the more hungry I was for more of a sort of folkloric vibe. And so then traditional witchcraft, British traditional witchcraft, that sort of stuff was coming in more through books, and then just sitting out in the nature in England, and learning from, like, luckily the town that I'm from, there are burial mounds all around the hills that are surrounding it. It's a national park now. So I've been quite lucky that my hometown even had all these burial mounds, and I was like, oh, I'm reading about these techniques. I'll go and try this. And then I set out with the mounds and added that sort of, like, not feather to my cap, but I added like that to my practice. And the more I read about that, the more I realized, oh, actually, this is a practice that has been done for a very, very long time. And then moving to Iceland, I was really lucky because then I got in with the right people here, to actually now have been invited and initiated into a family tradition in Iceland, which is the main aspect of what I do now. Stuff that I've learned here, stuff that I've been incredibly fortunate to learn, and also learning Icelandic. I don't speak perfect Icelandic yet. It's very, very tough, but learning enough of the language, and I mean, at least enough now to translate various books of folklore from like 1860. So I feel like that's enough of a flex for me to say that, like, that's my level of Icelandic, which is, I think it's good.
No, that is great. And not to mention you have the immersion too, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
That's fantastic. I mean, textual studies is always a difficult thing. Like, I am very confident in my German and Portuguese, for example, but like and so I can translate. But like, speaking is a different sort of beast entirely, which I feel good about now, but like it takes like, I would say like 4 years maybe of a continuous study to feel like there's a click at some point where you go from like, I hear you and I understand you, but I speak back in English, to like, oh, I'm generating now. Especially when you start like thinking into language, like that's always really exciting, right? Like language learning is something that we talk about a lot on the podcast. It's something that's really near and dear to our hearts, and it's just a reminder for folks that like time will pass anyway. You might as well be sucking less at it in 4 years than being exactly where you are right now, because it's a slow, slow climb, right? And so many of us are so verbose and kind of like chatty, and it can be strange to feel like we can't articulate our thoughts as precisely and eloquently as we want to. When I was first learning English, that was like a huge motivation for me to become less introverted, because I was very, very shy as a kid. And so when I realized like, oh, like no one speaks my language here, I have to learn English and eventually French, it was definitely one of those things where it was like, oh, well, this now I can communicate with people, so I have to kind of put myself out there. So like even if you're learning a language, like it's good to be like, no, 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 we don't have to switch to English. Let me try.
It's a struggle, especially in a country where everybody speaks English. And also working in tourism in a country where everyone speaks English, that's been a real struggle for me to like really push friends to speak to me in Icelandic more. But that's the only way I feel to really get it.
Absolutely. You
Yeah.
were on Austin and Marshall's podcast, Southern Bramble, talking quite a bit about like elements of Icelandic folk magic, and you have great books on it too. So like there's people are in for a treat if they're just discovering your work to like hear all about like what you've learned and how you've kind of synthesized it. Today, I'm really curious to talk to you a little bit about what the actual mechanics of learning Icelandic folk magic was like for you. So you mentioned you've initiated into a family practice. All three of us have like so many secrecy taboos on like what we can and cannot say in public, who we can and cannot acknowledge as a mentor publicly. Like I mean, the people that train me and some of the systems that I go through, like there's a reason I don't name them out loud. One, no one would know them. You know what I mean? Like it's not like this is like a public name that would be easily identifiable. But two, like there are like literal taboos around like what I can and cannot say. So like this is not to this is just a kind of like bracket for our listeners. If you hear us avoiding certain things, that's intentional. So it's not because it didn't like come across our minds to talk about it. But I think that is something that's so essential. I was just speaking about this on Radical Alfheim podcast, where I had an episode where I was interviewed. And that they're like some of my mentors in Balkan traditional witchcraft and the Serbian folk magic, like they're not going to teach you unless you actually come live with them. Or if you come like directly like live, this is not a WhatsApp apprenticeship. This is something that you have to live there to speak a language. And furthermore, you need to also like like know how to like milk their sheep is the example I always give. And it just means like make yourself useful. Like you're not just sitting there with your book being like, I will write down your oral lore, and like canonize it, and spread it to people for clout. This is the thing where they're like, okay, well, if I'm going to teach you these oral charms, if I'm going to teach you this plant knowledge, if I'm going to teach you these spirit pacts, then like you should be ideally making yourself incredibly useful in very physical ways. Like that the best stuff that you learn sometimes is because you're doing the dishes or because you're like sweeping and cleaning and putting up the laundry, and then you're having these interesting like discussions on what is spirit flight and like what parts of your soul are the ones that are leaving, what happens to your animal bodies and so on. Like that's when I've noticed that stuff happening. And so like I would say that's one of the first discussions that you and I even clicked on in the Seattle airport, like random coffee shop that we got our lattes in.
It's the rolling cigarettes as a form of payment, I think, for learning learning from elders.
That is the fun thing though about traditions that are primarily and necessarily transmitted orally. Just the late night, I just worked my ass off for 8 hours and we're just chilling in the kitchen and someone rolls in, they're like, okay, let's talk about this random deep lore that just popped into my brain, and just being in community and having that experience with, other people who might be around or just with that family being a very important thing too.
Absolutely. So how many years have you been in Iceland now?
So it's 8 now, since what year is it now? It's 2024. Oh God, I can't do math. And this is a struggle I have with D&D as well. Okay, so no, so 7. So not quite 8. 7 and a chunk.
Key is a living calculator, just so you know. Like when we're at a restaurant and everyone has like a different order and we're all splitting the bill, like he will mentally calculate their individual tips. So like that's why it's finally one of us can do math.
Don't have to whip out the steampunk calculator.
with the gas-powered little buttons.
Yeah. my whirring steam engine computation engine,
Yeah. Precisely. I like that the landscape of this conversation is still it was originally a Renaissance festival, then it is transitioned to a steampunk festival, or like at the intersection of the two of them, because there's always people who like show up to one dressed as the other. I think that's the three of us are that we just got lost. Well, that's awesome. Like, Kina make a huge effort to travel to the places, geographically to the dwellings of our mentors for the traditions that we share in common. So one of the things that, in addition to like learning languages and cultural immersion, like I imagine like so much of like what makes Icelandic folk magic, specifically Icelandic, and not Swedish, not Norwegian, not Danish, not any of the other kinds of like broader cultural arrays, is really experience the best by being there, by seeing like, oh, this is a small place. Everyone knows each other. Like if you're gonna pose as an authority on something, or if you're gonna start sharing information, everyone will know where you got it from. And there is something very sobering about that in a more online occult world in which people can just kind of like buy an altar off of Etsy, take a nice sexy photograph with their taxidermied animals and skulls in the background, and be like, I'm a traditional witch, you know? And then it's just like, well, you know, you are someone who maybe consumes through capitalism, you know, like the aesthetic of this, and who buys the right books and learns how to like speak in this language that is very much still tinged with um the circles that are evolved out of Britain, you know. But are you doing witchcraft or are you doing magic? You know, is entirely different because that's not something you can necessarily like photograph or share. That is something that comes across, you know, through the results of that person and also through the person's ability to communicate that in their own way, right? I would say that there's certain hints, you know, that something's going on. And so like I think that's a fascinating perspective though, like being able to kind of like get like, oh, this is why this is done because there's this festival that literally takes place right there. It's not that far, you know, and so of course it would be timed seasonally with these other kinds of like harvesting of these plants and so on.
Exactly. I mean, also like Iceland is so small that like you can't. It's what 370,000 people in the whole country. So like you can't hide anything. Like there's no like there's no way that you could say, oh yeah, I learned this from this person, that person that doesn't exist because everybody knows everyone
Yeah.
exists. So it's yeah.
How does that translate to you? Because you talk a lot about animism. Like, how does that translate to you in like the spirits? Because one thing that like when I've had friends visit my city and I've been like, oh, there's a spirit that's right here, you know, or like I want, or sometimes I won't even say that. Like, I'll just be like, I want to see what they'll pick up, and like we get the same impression of the same spirit in the same area. Like I'm, you know, in where I'm from, which is also a fairly small country, although more larger population than Iceland, but certainly like still small. Um, everyone kind of like knows the same features. And so there's a real lore built around the same hills and mountains and rivers and so on, you know, like that is continually acknowledged by people, even those who are kind of more secular atheists. Like they'll just know about it because it's in the culture. Like they'll just like, oh yeah, of course, like that river, you know. So I'm curious as to how that kind of maps onto how you understand what it's like to do spirit work in a country that's not the one you were born in.
I think like personally for here, like pretty uniquely, there's a book that I have that is literally a catalogue of this place name, the spirit of this place, the lore of this, like every corner of the country. There is like everybody knows, or not everybody, but the people who know the names of the spirits of these individual places. And it's I feel like it's quite unique in that there's less not like guesswork, but you don't have to do like as much of like the legwork to get the information because it's there, and it's also like it's there in a book that's available for people to buy, which is I think that's super interesting. But I think like animism, just as like as an inherently Icelandic thing, whether they realize that that's the way they're looking at stuff or not, like just the way that you're brought up here, like you don't step on the moss, you don't step on the rocks, you don't move this rock because the elves live there and they're gonna mess you up if you move their stuff. And whether people, I guess it's sort of a bit similar to Irish fairy belief of, it's best not to, just in case. Like it's for some people it's that sort of attitude, but I think like the attitude really in Iceland is like animism is just in people's understanding of everything from a very young age, and they don't. It's not called animism. I mean, like
Mm.
the word. That's the thing. There's not even. You could say like anthropru maybe as like spirit faith, but there's not really like. It's so common that there's not really. There is a word, like you could use a couple of words, but it's not common that people will know of that word in relation to like the thing that they're doing or the way that they're behaving. It's never been described as that.
I really appreciate you saying that. This is something I was just talking to Key and Salt about earlier, which was like the fact that like you know it's present when there's not a name for it necessarily. Like there's no need to point to it as like a solid tradition to differentiate apart from other things. It's so baked into their culture that's just there. So to even call it like there's many languages that don't have a word for religion, for example, because like what we would call religion is baked into every aspect of their sports, their arts, their culture. You know what I mean? Like in that way, like sometimes you hear like in Serbian, for example, you might hear like narodne vere, like folk beliefs, for example, or narodne običaje, like folk customs, and so on. And you might hear things like that, or like traditions of our fathers, like the things that our grandparents did, and so on. But generally, we don't really say animism other than like people who've read anthropology books. And they're like, oh
Hmm.
yes, I read Mircea Eliade, I want to talk about shamanism and animism and all these other kinds of things. But like it's not really a thing on people's minds because like well it's almost like taking it for granted. It's like, well, yeah, of course spirits are real, now granted, like I'm not even people who are very secular and who grew up post communist Yugoslavia are very much like no, that's all like silly folk beliefs. But all those people in my family, when they come back to the village, they're like very respectful around certain stones, and very nervous around them too. So I will say I think it's important to consider how the language that we use about things in English does reflect the kind of academic training, even if we're not academics ourselves, that a lot of us have, and the kind of content that we consume about magic, right? Is that even like to differentiate something as like a folk, my question that I hammer home all the time, I know it's probably annoying, is like, who is the folk? Who are the actual people that are engaging in these practices outside of your books, and also to be aware of how books canonize things, right? Which is when we all write, and all of us do, there is a kind of heaviness to our shoulders of like, what does it mean to canonize? And I think it's interesting because like this is something that like Gemma Gary did a really good job of saying in the beginning of her very first book, like this is not right.
Hmm.
This is
Hmm.
not, I'm not saying this is like 100% authentic Cornish witchcraft. Like this is something that I've kind of tooled and understood and I received from spirits and kind of like tinkered and so on. And she does a great job of outlining what that is. And then everyone is like, this is Cornish witchcraft. So even if you use disclaimers the way that all three of us do, and say, like, I take pains to elaborate on, like, I'm from this region of Serbia, this is what I know, these are the languages that I speak, this is the access that I have, this is the training that I have. I can't go too into some of the secrecy of certain initiations that I have that are family traditions, but that I've been brought into, but I can like elaborate on some aspects of this folk magic. And I'm sure some people are still gonna be like, oh my God, like this is how it is everywhere. I'm like, no, it's so regionally different that like it's gonna be different from village to village, but also, as you point out, it's a small place. People will know where it's coming from.
Hmm.
Which I think is a good thing
Exactly.
because I feel like there's not a lot of accountability in occult spaces. Like, we had a Q&A question from our patrons that was like, what is one thing that's like underrated in the occult world? And one of the things that I blurted out was like, I don't know, citing your sources. Like, and I
Hmm.
don't just mean a citation of a book, but just even orally acknowledging where something comes from. So I think you have a real privilege in being able to be like, you can't escape that in Iceland. Like, there is no way
Absolutely.
to make that work otherwise.
And even like, all the, well, so I say all the sources for my books, there's not a huge amount of sources, like a huge list of different books that I'm sourcing for the work that I've written, because that's that. Like there aren't that many books on this in Iceland, because so much of it is lived experience. And the few folklorists who has been and collected everything, they've been thorough enough that like I don't need 18 books on this one tiny island because I have, the 5, 6 that I regularly will look at, which often they're bouncing off each other anyway. It's just such a small place that it's so hard. Every single story will say in this exact village at this exact time, this thing happened.
Oh
And
my
also
God.
like since I love it though, because then since the settlement of Iceland, every single name of every person has been written down.
Mm.
Um, well, not originally, but after the year 1000 ish. Um, and so depends. Some things have been carved in places, but there's it's been very thorough, really, for a very very long time. So I'm really lucky that I can I don't know. There'll be times when when I'm talking to tourists at work because I work part time in a hotel, and they'll say like, oh, where do you want to, they'll be like, oh, where would you recommend? Like, where should I go? What can I see that's like off the beaten track? And I'm like, well, there's nowhere off the beaten track because every single corner of this country is known. There's like wilderness in the middle of nowhere, um, but there's no like secret places. But then also like depending on what they want, I can say like, oh, you should go to this place. This is a nice like friendly place. I won't tell them like the vibes of the spirits to the people that I've just met at this at the hotel that I work at, but it's nice that I can then really sort of even tailor like, oh, you can go to this place because it has this feel, or this place won't be offended by by much. Whereas don't go to this place because this place has had enough of tourism. And that's been quite a struggle recently as well, because there's so much tourism that it's been tough, because really the land is like, it's screaming out to be left alone. And no one is listening to that, because why would people making money off of tourism and capitalism want to stop? But yeah, it's sorry, that's another segue. But,
No, I love it. I mean, I think it's interesting being so in tune with a land that has embraced you, but then also be aware of what your positionality is as someone who's like, kind of like an immigrant. I think that's fascinating to me. I mean, I'm also an immigrant. I don't live in the country I was born in, evidently by my accent, right? And so it's one of those things that I think about a lot in terms of like how I've tried to really learn directly from indigenous people and knowing like what are the customs of this exact area, like how can I make offerings to land spirits here, how can I also understand what it's like to live in a metropolis full of so many different diasporas, it's and that are bringing their own food and culture and spirits with them, seeing spirits from places that I don't expect, and then realizing I just walked by like a whole enclave for a community that I wasn't aware of. And this is exactly where their area of town is. And so, of course, that's something like that showed up. Like, there's definitely an element to which, when you have cultivated a real respect for land spirits, is to also understand like what does it mean to have that relationship, is also to know that like land spirits don't owe you anything. You owe them everything, but they don't owe you anything, because
exactly.
usually your presence is detrimental at best. Just so like, what does it mean to have this symbiotic relationship, or to make some attempt to have a better relationship, especially because they are the ones that like gatekeep blessings coming in and through your house. Like how can the magic that you've cast come back to your door if the road is blocked on the crossroad, or the hill won't let it come over, like that is something I think about a lot, because it's I do a lot of like cleanup stuff, like Key as well. Like, we've talked about this, but like, what does it like mean to like just clear up trash and litter? Like, Key has this area near his one of like the main rivers where he lives that he's really done a lot of work with. And like we talked about this in the Gathering Materia episode, right? But like you clean up trash there regularly, and then you leave one cigarette on this rock, and anything you ask for comes to you. Like, I need this root, and this root is now on that rock. Like, it is a spirit trading market. And that to me is like way better than reading a book on like what is it, what do academics think of the word animism? What does it mean to like I'm not like poo-pooing the word, I'm just saying it's a good descriptor, but like are you living it or are you theorizing it, right?
Exactly.
There's also a really interesting interplay between, as you theorize it and codify it, how does that go back into the practice, right? Because suddenly, if you write down, hey, here's the rock where you can leave cigarettes, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, a cult of that spirit has arisen. Or, a standardization of practice toward like a given record where it's like, oh, this is the way that this is done. And then all the practitioners see that, and their clientele also see that, and they're like, oh shit, if I don't see it being done that way, then I'm going to go to the people who do it that way. And it creates this complex, kind of feedback that I think is fun to play with and fun to, realize in practice. It's things will work eventually if you're in right relationship with the spirits, and especially the spirits of wherever you are.
Yeah, exactly. And with like on that, there's a mountain opposite the bay. It's called Asia. It's named after supposedly named after an Irish witch from one of the sagas. I don't know if it's still there. There was a group who on a farm beneath that were causing all sorts of problems. Also bringing in, people. I want to say mostly sort of new agey scammy type stuff, but bringing people in and doing all sorts of different ceremonies and stuff that are not in keeping with the way that we act and the way that we treat things here. And it made the land very angry and very upset. And like this was happening, and a bunch of people really like sort of at the same time in different places that weren't talking about this thing to each other suddenly all got this information. And then all of us were like, oh, okay, hey, I feel like there's something there. And then it's like, okay, there's something there. Let's do a bit of divination. turns out there was a whole lot of stuff going on that the land was very, very upset about because people didn't know how to treat things. And even, even Icelandic people who have been raised, not necessarily with the exact way to do things, but with a slightly better understanding of that than if maybe you weren't raised here, typically then it happens that people are still doing things the wrong way when they could just come to a source that's that's not like, because there's a lot of stuff that we don't talk about massively outside of our groups, but there's still like a lot of people know who is into witchcraft in the country. And even like even for me, for someone who's not been here for not even a full decade yet, I have people come to me regularly here and say like, oh, I know that you're into this, can you teach me about this or help me with this problem? And lots of native people who are asking for this from me as well. So it's I don't know, I feel like it's difficult even when you're raised in the place where this information is like fairly readily available. It still needs to be taught. People still need to like have the lived experience and still need to know like, okay, we don't do this thing in this way because it's going to cause problems. And then everybody else will know, whether we tell them or not, they're all going to find out. So yeah, it's it's a stress.
Imagine there's a really interesting kind of documented history of trial and error with figuring out what works with these spirits, having been, inhabited for what, roughly 1,000 years by people and by spirits far longer than that, and being able to point to, okay, people got here probably around this date, and ever since they've just been trying to figure it out.
And there's still so much sort of trolly, like like the sort of wintertime flip that happens here as well. It's so extreme that if you're doing stuff the wrong way in winter, when when the stuff that is normally it's retreated into the mountains in summer, summer is the human time, really. It tends to be the time that all the people go out of their farms and they're out in the nature and they're doing the work in the land. And then winter comes and everyone's back in their farms and they can't leave because like infrastructure in this country is still not amazing for roads and public transport. But you have then winter where it's the really harsh time where like you will literally die if you go outside. The spirits really reflect that. So there's a lot of warnings. Like there's no shortage of warnings about doing stuff the wrong way here. Yet it still happens often.
Something that you said earlier about like having that book of all the toponyms of like here's what everything is called and here's the spirits associated with it. Like there are versions of that I've seen like for my own country, and it's interesting how many of them, as always, are like a lot of folklore, right, is completely mostly fixated on like warnings of what not to do because it's like hard lessons learned from difficult winters, in my case much less extreme than in Iceland, but like even the animals that require like whose guardianship is the most fickle and whose deities associated with them are the most extreme and punishing are the very ones that like are actually a problem, and can genuinely hurt your livelihood by killing your, like for example, wolves, killing your sheep, killing your livestock and so on. Like what is them like that is an actual thing people can be genuinely besought by, or like hail, and why like whether so much weather magic is against repelling hail and against turning the winds away when they come and they bring their disease and so on. There's a lot of like it's only a theory in your mind if you just read books, but if you actually there and you feel that change and you realize like, oh, after November 9th you start to feel the cold come in, like that's after Ratindan, and you see exactly that shift take place, and then it makes sense like why, oh, you're hearing the wolves more often, they're coming out of the mountains and so on. Like there is a real sense of like, oh, these are the wolf days, not just because it's an arbitrary day on a calendar that we observe to be like make our little wheel of the year, but like this is an actual folk practice because it reflects the needs of the folk. It like reflects their actual livelihood needs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even like less dangerous to people, but more sort of utilizing stuff while it's there. So the feast of the Assumption of Mary, that's like the last day really to get good plants, because in like a couple of weeks everything's gone, and then it's winter again. there's no, yeah, here it is very, very much. There is winter, there is summer, there's not much in between. There's like a week and a half, 2 weeks of of legit spring, and then suddenly everything is there, and then it goes away just as fast. So there's I feel like there's definitely a lot of that here with yeah, specific dates. If you don't have the hay in by this time, you're fucked. If you don't have, if you haven't stored enough food, then it's obviously nowadays that's not as extreme. But for foraging and for gathering plants and stuff, it's like you have a very small window. And as that's like the biggest aspect of what I do is plant magic, it's like it's a stress to make sure that I've earned enough money to live by going to work. But every time I go to work for the day, I'm also giving up one day that I can go and gather plants. So yeah.
That is something that is so fascinating to me. Like, one thing that I think is hugely like special about Iceland in that way is that, like, as you were saying, like every day that you don't go and harvest plants in the sunlight is a day that you miss the sunlight, right? It's a day that because you're doing other things, and like that's also a good time to vacation. It's a good time to do, like you were saying, like summer is the day, this time that you do everything in it anyway. So it's just you feel the heat of the land, I imagine, the busyness of everything being so concentrated in such a short amount of time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then it's gone very fast. So you
Yeah.
really have to, which I feel like there's also it's quite a culturally Icelandic thing to I mean the phrase, cultural phrases like "Þetta like it's all gonna work out by itself
Mhm.
anyway, which in many cases that's true. Um, but I think that's sort of also where this attitude maybe comes from of like you have a limited time to do stuff. If it doesn't happen this time, it'll happen next time because there's no other choice. So you have to just let it go and just be okay with you just have to go with the flow, which I think I feel like maybe that's where partially where this attitude comes from in Iceland of just if you've missed it, you've missed it. That's
Mm.
it. So,
But the next year will come.
but then winter is coming always.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I think with, such a dramatic seasonal shift obviously going to be affecting the plants that are there, how they're worked with, all these different things, and how different that can be based on that geography with other practices of yours. Like you are the Sussex Peller, you're doing things in a Sussexy way. So
Not the
not
facility.
the Sussexy.
Oh my God, I'd never thought of that.
Okay, okay, I'm gonna make you
Okay.
clip that later.
Nasty.
Yeah. But having this set of techniques that have arisen in England that you're familiar with, when you can go gather plants on certain days to harvest certain properties, or even the species of plants that are available to you themselves. How have you noticed this kind of translating back to Iceland, or your Icelandic folk practices translating back to the UK?
So like I think it's made me appreciate going like to visit the UK more because plants will be around for a lot longer there. And obviously there's a bunch of stuff that I can get there that I can't get here. Like even mugwort. Mugwort doesn't grow here. Like doesn't grow in the wild. And there's a bunch of plants that just on like a really practical level, there's stuff that I can get in the UK easily, or I can grow, and even stuff that like I can go to my mum's place and sow some seeds, and then like come back later in the year and it will be there waiting for me, which is very nice. There's stuff like that, yeah, stuff like that makes me very much appreciate going back to the UK. And I think also with the way that I interact with spirits here, or the way that I've learned to interact with spirits here, taking that back to the UK, now like having experienced a lot more like Utasatha, like the sitting out, having experienced that a lot more here, and that being quite a big part of what I do. To take that back to the UK, my relationship with just the hills around my hometown has changed because I feel like I've honed that skill here. I take it back there, and it's something I was doing. Also, I mean, that was years and years ago, so maybe it's just an experience thing. But I feel like it's the way that I do it, the way that I've learned to do it, has really helped me like dig deeper when I'm in Sussex. And also interestingly, I had more of a sort of the devil played a bit more of a role in my Sussex practice, whereas in Iceland, it's like there are stories about the devil, there's folklore about the devil, but the devil is not the devil of the continent. He's not like this, the big scary, the big bad guy. The devil didn't really have as much sort of strength, I guess, here, and there wasn't so much fear in the devil here as there was in trolls, and in the nature already could kill you by like going outside at the wrong time. So I feel like that definitely is it's changed the way that I interact with stuff. And I have a bit more of a sort of separation of when I'm in Sussex, I do this stuff, I honor these spirits, I work with these spirits. When I'm in Iceland, I do this stuff. Yeah, I think it's much more. And even now, like when I'm spending more time in Sweden, on Gotland, this island in the Baltic Sea, my relationship with that place too is completely different, and it feels like a third flavor. And the techniques, they're all, it's all Northern Europe. Like the techniques are pretty similar, but to work them in these different places, like on Gotland, where you have 3,000-year-old burial mounds. Now I know how to approach that in a way that I would think is as respectful as I can be. Whereas if I'd have just been in the UK, my approach to these burial mounds in these places that are in the national park, it's protected land, but it's land that's changed and been managed very differently since these people were buried in these mounds. Yeah, I think the techniques have remained the same, but like the way they've all like fed back into each other has been really, really useful for me. And the fact that they're all so similar, it's been massively helpful.
I imagine the keepers of those memories, like within the mounds, if you're going to verse with them and figure stuff out, that is a huge blessing to have in terms of being able to adapt while staying like grounded in traditional technique. Like if you're to go to Iceland and be like, okay, well, I have this recipe that would work fantastically in the UK, but half those plants don't even grow here, and the other half I would have to go really far out of my way to find, just go sit on the mound and be like, hey, guy who has seen these plants live and die for 1,000 years, what is the closest substitute to this thing? How do I adapt?
I mean, that specifically, like that's a very that is a very, very specific. That's been invaluable. And also just to learn as well, because I think it's still Northern Europe. Like there are some plants from North America, some plants from Northern Europe that are crossing over in Iceland, which is nice for me because then I've learned a bunch of stuff about things that I've then seen when I've been in North America. But yeah, a bunch of plants that it's like, oh, okay, this exists. A substitute for this thing exists already here, and it's come very quickly, which has been very nice.
Yeah, it's a kind of a beautiful art form to figure out. I can't get this thing here, so what do I do? And that is a testament to the skill of the practitioner, especially in your case. If you have to figure it out from kind of the ground up, if you can't, if you're like, I need to rely on a recipe a bit further afield. So it's a very, very interesting part of herbs, right?
Yeah, or even the fact that like I was saying, there's a huge Anglocentrism to the way that like tradcraft quote unquote books are written. Like most of it is rehashing like all those authors, right? We have to like go through the list, but like they're all really writing from that place. And so, you have people from around the world who are like, mugwort doesn't grow here, yarrow doesn't grow here. Like, what do I use? So it's like, well, that's actually why it would be great to like look into your own actual customs, as opposed to like trying to get in something that is not native to your biome. Because those are powerful plant allies, but like you value them more, I think, when you're there where they grow. Yeah, so I appreciate you noting that about the regions that you travel to often, is that like the spirits do speak to you differently. I would love to hear what your, I guess, experience is, or some like what you've gleaned from living in a place where there's such a dramatic dark and winter. And there are traditions that I practice where you do most things when it's sundown. And I have thought a lot about how easy that would be if it was always sundown. But I also imagine like, or even like in Serbian folkcraft and being like, oh, be careful when it's like dark. These spirits are out, during Nekršteni dani, the unbaptized days, between Christmas and Epiphany, the Karankonjole are out, you have the Drekavats is out, the Nekristeni, the unbaptized babies' heads on ravens' bodies are out. All these ghouls and goblins, right? And especially after dark. And I was thinking, what if it was always dark during January? What are the spirits like in response to that? What are the traditions like about what you can do magically during the time period? What is the witchcraft like there,
It is troll season.
Hmm.
Winter is very much troll season. And there's all this lore about don't become a troll yourself. Like if you
Mm.
there's a lot to do with hospitality as well. If you aren't considerate and caring about the people in your community, you could very well become a troll after you die and become a problem, and then someone else will have to deal with you. So don't behave like that. But yeah, for the darkness, I mean, mentally, it's occasionally a struggle. So there's that. But no, magically, it's interesting with with planetary hours. Even you have the night hours in winter. It's like you have an hour and a half at least. For the day hours, planetary hours, you have 15 minutes, and then that flips. So even just to do planetary stuff is it's fun and it's different. Yeah, in terms of going out, it's I mean, you can go outside, obviously. Like in winter, you're
Mm.
not going to immediately die. Um, but there are certain places you just can't reach. Like we can't go to certain places that we go to in summer. The roads are closed, they're covered in snow. There's stuff like that, like very sort of physical limits to things. It's also that there are certain areas, quite a few popular tourist areas as well, that in winter, you feel it, you feel it really flips, and I don't want to say it's not like a dark energy as a good evil whatever, it's nothing like that. It's just it's the winter, and either to me, to my understanding of it, it's there's this dual aspect to everything. Like plant spirits, there's so much dual aspect stuff here to what they do and how they work. And then with spirits of place, is it that the friendly, nice summertime ones will retreat into the earth, or is it just that then they're showing a completely different side? And it is this sort of, I think for me, it's a lot of spirits here have these two fairly distinct faces, often, which is interesting too, because they're being in certain areas you have a good relationship with. That feels fine. So I think it really is this thing of the spirits of the land will, for me, for most of my experience, and a lot of the stuff that I can't really, some stuff that I can't really talk about. But from my experience with a lot of it, you have spirits in certain places, that have two masks essentially. And if you know the spirit, it's fine. If you haven't done that work, you'll get in the winter. If you want to start that, maybe starting to make relationships with certain spirits in winter, I would say in Iceland, wait until summer with some
Hmm.
things, because they do literally have a nicer face.
Hmm.
But it's yeah, it's interesting. I think also with the with sort of this dark elf, light elf thing of Norse mythology as well. A lot of that I think comes more from Snorri, from him writing for these Norwegian kings, in including a certain amount of heavily Christian things, so that it
Yeah.
didn't seem super pagan. So I don't necessarily think that there is a faction of light elves and a faction of dark elves and they have a war, and I don't think it's that sort of. I think it is just the spirits of the place. There are some for sure that will retreat into the earth over summer and not come back until summer comes back, and then the other ones that maybe not as nice ones will come up and come out, in some places. But I feel like it's a bit of both. Of there
Mm.
are the spirits that do that, and then there are the spirits that have two faces.
I mean, it's even just looking
Yeah,
at animals and their hibernation
Hmm.
cycles, right? It doesn't,
Exactly.
it's not,
Yeah.
it's that's why I think animism has so much to do with your biome, your region, right? It's just well, look at the actual plant life and the actual way they behave, even physically, because they are not separate from the spirits. The spirit of yarrow is in yarrow, right? So watch it grow, watch how it handles different kinds of weather phenomena. I think that is such a good point too. It's it doesn't, yes, it is dangerous, but it does not mean it is, amoral and immoral are the same thing, right? Like something being amoral and not at all being concerned about humanity does not mean it is quote unquote evil, and someone who's trying to present a very Christian story might want to say that, like, oh, here's the bad faction and here's the good guys and here's the ones that are more on the side of, God and the devil and so on. But like looking at it, like we get this a lot because like Slavic paganism is a whole beast, right? Mostly fake lore. Nothing was, written. This was not a literary culture. So, like, it's a lot of guesswork. It's a lot of anthropology. It's a lot of ethnology trying to figure out things. And it's a lot of, like, modern neo-pagans trying to kind of reconstruct things off of forged documents as well. So, just not a lot to go off of if you are looking for paganism. But if you're looking for spirits and you're willing to accept that people do work with them, but call them by different names, including saint names, for example, and their toponyms are still integrated into mountains and rivers and lakes and those other kinds of things. And like there are ways that people still respect them and adhere to them. It is not as pure as, like here's the original faith that was preserved, for like millennia that people want. That's not sexy for them, but it is actually there in remarkably preserved ways if we look at them, and if we know what you're looking for, if you're willing to engage actual folk and accept that like they're gonna call it Christianity, they're gonna call it like the faith that they actually practice, but they'll also be doing animal sacrifices and magic and leaving their bodies and like doing things that you're not going to hear Perun, but you will hear Ilya Gromovnik, Elijah the Thunderer, and you will see animals being given to him that are associated with Perun and so on. So like that I think is something to really note, is it's less about making something spookier than it is and more about respecting the actual danger that is inherent to a time of the, let's say winter time, not being particularly hospitable towards humans in general, right? So you're not special. But if you are doing things with certain kinds of spirits that are active, then if you already have a relationship with them that was built over the summer months, then like it makes sense that it's not like they're necessarily fully, if they're not the kind that like genuinely are gone, and you can't necessarily travel to their world in spirit, like they're of course that contact is still there, but their attitude is different because our attitudes are different in the winter too. We're happier and like, more like, yay, let's go and make merriment. Like there's a reason we do all these celebrations in the summer, and then in the winter we're a bit different. Although of course, depending on where you are, right? Some places don't have seasons, some places only have heat. And we certainly have Slavic Carnival and Koleda and so on that are merriment in the winter to celebrate the fact that like it is slowly transforming. But I picked up on a few things that you said there that I would love for you to explore a little bit more, which is common misconceptions. We made a little bit of fun of the Vikings. We made a little bit of like a little giggly girl moment in the beginning about the fact that like, yes, we do have our Viking tattoos, quote unquote, and we do have our drinking horns and so on. But like there is a lot of fake lore. This is not unique to Slavic stuff. I know the Norse, quote unquote, Norse traditions get that a lot. What would you say are like the biggest things that stick out to you? Because you also work in the tourism industry, so that's hard, right? People come in, they like, I want to see the Vikings. I imagine, like, I want to see the people who are still worshiping the ancient gods, like today,
Oh yeah.
Mm.
Which and that's I mean that's a whole thing in itself of like there is the also through like the actual faith here.
Mhm.
They have a church. They've been building a temple for a long time, and when it's done, it's like that's going to be nice for 5 minutes because it will become a tourist attraction, and there will be no calm, quiet place other than actually going out into the nature to do any sort of worship like that. But yeah, I think that's the other thing as well. If you have the also through angle of the faith angle, but then within the folk magic, it's much more. There is so much more Christianity in
Mhm.
Icelandic folk magic than there is any Nordic, yeah, any Nordic mythology. Yeah, there, we acknowledge a lot of. Well, okay, so interesting. Like spiritually, in terms of like animism and the stuff in the land, that's obviously like there's a lot of that that's still the same, and the approaches to those things, we don't know exactly what people thought back then, sadly, but I feel like a lot of the approaches to that haven't changed, maybe a huge amount just because Iceland is it's so small. There's so few people that's sort of like, obviously, there's been many, many years since the Viking Age, but the way that people still interact with the land because they have to, because that's what it is, and it's not going to change. There's that sort of stuff that is maybe more Viking-y, but there's so much that is not Viking-y. Staves, as like a perfect example are not Viking Age. I have a couple of times I've had people say, "Oh yeah, like the IS-helmet, like that's a Viking Age symbol." I'm like,
Mm.
no, it's not. Like, I mean, none
No.
of them. This very basic, like cruciform shape, like yes, that's obviously a very old symbol, but the many snowflakes of Icelandic folk magic are not. There is Solomonic seal inspired. Like lots of it comes from, you know, and Agrippa's planetary symbols we see in a bunch of staves. Like there's all this stuff that comes from, yeah, what 1500s ish, around that time, because that was the change from Catholic to Lutheran. We have records of the books that were kept in these libraries. We know that Agrippa's 3 books were in the main Christian centers of Iceland, the 2 main Christian centers. We have records of you know, priests being scolded for making staves that were like very obviously inspired by Christian magic. So it's, yeah, it's none of that is Viking, which it looks cool. It looks Viking. It looks very, you know, the symbols look, especially if they're like somewhat runic inspired, because then that's a whole other thing of like this romanticization. Romanticization, is that a word?
Hmm.
This it is romanticization of runes and of like of the Viking Age. Like people, it's not new that people have looked back to this as like something that's interesting and really thought that it was very much like the Vikings TV show, which obviously is that's not history. So
But
yeah,
but
it's
having runes, you know, etched into the side of my undercut is fucking badass, you know?
I love it. I think
I
it
love
looks
it too.
cool.
It looks badass.
um, but
Yeah, yeah. Like we were clowning around a little bit in the beginning about like Renaissance Fair festivals because we do love them. But like it is genuinely like the difference between aesthetic and enjoying aesthetic, including cheeky aesthetic. Like one of my closest friends literally understands Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? Like she knows how to read it. She can go to a museum and tell you exactly what dynasty things are just by looking at them without looking at the little blurb in the museum. And she also venerates Kemetic deities, right? But she loves a kitschy Egyptology mug. You know, like where like it doesn't say anything, it's just random hieroglyphs. It's like complete gibberish, something not even actual hieroglyphs. Like those like kitschy little museum souvenir shop type stuff. Like she loves it, you know. So there's an element to which you can be like, oh, that's cute, I love it. Like I'm the same with some Slavic stuff. I'm like, oh, I see what you're trying to do. That's so adorable. I want that, you know. But it is important to know what is actually history and what is romanticization. I find that fascinating because the staves, I mean, having listened to you present on them before, right? You know, the overlap with sigil magic is absolutely fascinating. The way in which like you can essentially make your own and play around with existing symbols and combine them in certain ways and then enchant them in certain ways. I love that. And I love that you do share techniques to do that. But I also love your emphasis that like there are alphabets, like runic or otherwise, that you can use in symbol sets. And like a group is a huge part of that. This is not actually that old, but it is everywhere. You know, you can see them, and it's a good technology that just works. Like there's a reason many cultures have discovered that those kind of pictorial emanations of that can be brought to you by spirits that can be overlaid, you know, through your own will. There's a reason it does work, right? Kind of like petition statements. And so there's no reason not to play around with them. It's just understand their history first as well.
exactly.
But damn, there is a whole thing about the Vikings, like, and you know, as a profession, not just as a people, right? It's not an ethnic group, but like,
Hmm. Well, I
but yeah,
think that's what people forget. Like,
yeah, yeah,
because that is,
yeah,
I mean, it is just you go and you raid. That's what you do. Like,
yeah.
which also, like, you know, not great set of behaviors and habits. So, yeah, I don't know. It's so yo. Now I'm going into into my like default mode of yeah. I think yeah. The main thing that I struggle with is just when I tell people this and then they get upset. And I'm like, no, but it works. Like it actually, it
Hmm.
doesn't matter that it's not some ancient symbol. Like it does
Hmm.
what it's supposed to do. So, you know, the fact that it's, I mean, even the Vegvisir, like this, one of the fairly common ones, and people call it the Viking compass. It's not a Viking compass. It's from 1860. We know the name of the guy who created the grimoire that it's in, and I mean, not even really proper grimoire because it's more just a collection of staves. But we know who he was. We know where he did this. We know that this stave is not even 200 years old, but it's tattooed on thousands and thousands and thousands of people
Hmm.
as a Viking compass. But I mean, I personally think that it does what it says it does. So that's, good enough.
But like you raise such an important point because what another thing that is not ancient is Agrippa. And yet his seals work, like that's the whole thing about grimoires, right? It's like someone did something, the spirits showed up, they agreed that these seals work to conjure them. Ideally if the grimoire is not and I won't even get into pseudepigraphy and forgery here and what you need to do to like sell your grimoire and include it in like a list of folios that like the manuscript title that it's assigned in a library is only the first 5-page pamphlet at the top, but all the other things underneath it all get classified as Goetia or whatever like that, but it's actually all completely other things that are included in the folio. Whatever, that's for, library science and historians to yap about more than me. But I think it's important to be like, so what it works, like the angel does show up when you call it. Like, you know what I mean? Like if you look at the intelligence and spirit, those are like actual beings that show up for many people. Like these seals work, the certain symbols in like modern I would say like, ATRs that are very lineaged in where their sources come from, but they were systematized only more recently in the last 200 years. Like those seals work. They call the spirits. They've been proven time and time again, right? It's not a thing to fear, but I think that there is this level of like kind of backlash towards Christianity and being like, I want to go back to the true Margaret Murray, or source of like what was the original pagan cult. And so there's a resistance of things that are slightly newer, even if they're things that are also working, because like it's not like the gods don't exist or can't be called upon. It's just to understand that like they are clever than, any human. Like they can sneak their power into anything and use any mask if they need to. We should not be so, I would say, arrogant to think that, that is not the case, right? So I'll put that gently. There's nothing wrong at all about, I mean, I venerate so many different deities, and I'm also a Christian, and also like all these other kinds of things, hashtag folk Christianity, whatever. I have gone on that rant many times on the podcast and off. It is not necessary to hear it over again about how what we want to call like a dual faith, whatever. Like it is the way that people live, So like even if other people might look at you and wag their finger and be like, that's not proper, whatever, at the end of the day, like these questions of like folk and dual are ultimately categories anthropologists impose upon people who just identify only as one thing. And they're like, I'm just a normal Christian. The fact that I give animal sacrifice to my ancestors and to various fairies is entirely separate, So I would say that yeah, I think it's an important point that you raised that like people should not be bulldozing actual culture and living tradition because they want to find an imagined past that may not exist in the way you think it does, because the historical record was also written by predominantly Christians, right? When it comes to what Icelandic history is.
Mm-hmm. Also, just quick with Mary and Freya
Mm-hmm.
are like very much assimilated here.
Mm-hmm.
In so many ways, in names of plants, in certain places, streams, springs, and for us, it's like a thing that we will respect and venerate, like Mariufreya as a sort of new, not new, but like as a
Mm-hmm.
amalgamation of these two deities, and it makes sense for us, and that's just something that we do.
Mm-hmm.
But if I try telling that to a bunch of, even the Alsathru people who are more sort of hardcore here, they have much more of this sort of like pagan purist idea. Even then they get like, oh, but like, no, that's not right. And it's like, no, but we know that like you have Mary called on, there are records of Mary being called on to wreck ships and things like this, which like we know that that's not a typically Mary thing, because that's not really her. Yeah, she's not really in with the hurting people in many places, but in some, it's I talk to people about that occasionally, and they just I feel like they have a lot of this like pagan purism, and they don't really get that that's not how stuff works. Things don't stay the same forever, and things change, and they evolve, and lots of things get smushed together and become something else.
It's a really interesting, argument to make with all of the virtues and scholarship and beautiful work that goes into reconstruction. I think it's just important to not forget that these things are still done. There is, a virtue to rebuilding, but here's people who have been doing it in their family for the past 1,000 years. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of my point is like I love
mhm.
Mokosh, a fantastic goddess, deeply near and dear to my heart. My whole family is for them it's Sveta Petka. It's Saint Petka through and through, and she also comes from many different deities. She can be basically any goddess she wants to be, you know. And so the plant lore that we have that relates to Mokosh is extremely related to Petka, and that's a good thing, you know. That's not I would say that like Reconstruction, like you were saying, Key, is its own beautiful effort and joyous celebration of the fact that these gods still grip people today, you know, and they're not gone, you know, they
Mhm.
absolutely gripped people and call them and are interacting with people to this day. And that is something that is really special, you know, and wonderful. And that's not like a thing that at all that I in any way look down on. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I would just say that it's also important to consider that some of these practices and these cultures, especially for people who are coming at it from like an American perspective or from a Canadian perspective, or like, you know, they're coming from it not really living there or having it visited or seeing it only temporarily from like a brief tourist point of view, is that there are people to this day who are grappling with the same spirits under different names or under continued syncretic names. You know, I love the whole Mary Freya thing that you mentioned because it makes me think of like the way that, you know, Egyptian gods very happily syncretize within their own culture. You know, you have like Aset and Serket, you know, Isis and Serket, the scorpion goddess, very famously, you know, across many boards. You know, you have Sekhmet and Hetert or Hathor, you know, the lion-faced goddess and the cow-faced goddess. Like it's that's like a known thing, you know, because gods absolutely do fusion dance, as it were. And so that's something that I think is so beautiful, you know. So like one way that you can respect the ancestors of the culture whose gods you want to also reach out to or reaching out to you is by learning the language and like learning what those customs are today, even if they are Christian or even if they are Muslim or Jewish or they've changed, you know. But being interested in the ways those changes have occurred. It doesn't mean you can't go full pagan. That's absolutely a possibility. It's more that like I think it's a beautiful effort to give to those spirits by saying like I will learn what the ancestors that have venerated this for ages are doing now, because there are living ancestors, there's living elders, you know, there's living people who carry these kinds of wisdom and who've done so much. And as you were saying, in Iceland, people kind of know who they are. You know, it's not that mysterious. They would have figured it out if there were more. And so I think there's something really special there about like what you've done and how you've gone to and received initiation from a family tradition and have gone out of your way to like balance this with your own background without feeling like squeamish about it and still feeling like, okay, maybe I do some things differently depending on the literal land that I'm on. That makes sense. But those spirits you carry with you. And we make folklore, you know, by existing. The fact that like you are, you know, Sussex Peller, as it were, and you're also doing Icelandic folk magic and so on, and you've and other traditions, I'm sure, like that is being made in you, right? You know, the fact that I'm Serbian and also Kimbandera and also a bunch of other things. Like that is new folklore that I'm making, you know. And so, you know, when we all pass, what will our children say about us and what will their grandchildren say about us, you know, is hopefully that, you know, we carry these spirits well. And I think that is ultimately the best we could ask, you know, of the fact that we're all people who adore spirits, who adore these traditions, and who have given so much of our time, money, and effort not vacationing, but instead studying with other people and going to other places to do exactly that. And you know, in your case, even like transitioning to teaching and with this full support of your lineage and the full support of your mentors and permission to be like, yes, actually, you are a great person and a great voice to articulate these things. Don't feel lesser than for, you know, not having been born here. Like, absolutely, you've done the work, you know. And I think that kind of confidence and there's nothing better than knowing that your spirits and your tradition back you, because at the end of the day, you're not here to exert yourself as an authority in the sense of like I know the true way it's done. You can present a way that it's done. And one thing I love about your presentations is that you're like, I got this from Agrippa, I got this from other sources. I just played around with this and it made it work, you know. And I think that, or like this plant, my personal understanding is I take it, I put it to Venus for these reasons, and therefore I also put it to this cluster of deities and this cluster of saints. Great, you know. And you could just see that that wasn't just like random Aleister Crowley 777 tables of correspondence. That was like while I talked to the plant and set up meditation in the cold and realized something because of the way that like the spirits came to me.
Yeah, it's I feel like I should say it more, but I do say it all the time of like I've been really lucky to be like to be where I am now and to know to know what I know because I've been taught by the right people and been and had that been shared with me like it's like I it's really rare. Like I'm really yeah, I feel really lucky, and I think I'm too British to not be humble about stuff. But that's one thing that constantly keeps me grounded in like I'm a guest. Like I'm involved now, but to some, to some people's minds here, I will forever be a guest. I won't ever be,
Hmm.
whether I have a passport or not, I won't ever be truly Icelandic, to some people. But to the right people, at least, I've been trusted with this, and I'm like, yeah, I'm incredibly lucky, and I never want to forget that. And that's why I always, I'm always so upfront about, like, yes, I'm not from Iceland. My Instagram name is literally Sussex Bella. In the first pages of my book, it will say I grew up in the UK. So like, but yeah, I feel like I've been lucky enough to be trusted with carrying it.
Yeah.
Keeps me humble. I feel it keeps me like as humble as I can be. Yeah,
No, I
down
relate
to
to that
earth.
so much. Yeah, that's so beautiful. And that's one of the biggest privileges in my life is I know I'm lucky to carry the tradition that I do from my home country, from the experiences I've had there. He is probably the person who's more than anyone outside of the Balkans seen what I'm talking about because I took him there and he got to see some of it firsthand. So he knows it's not just he doesn't have to rely on my, vouching for it. Like he's seen it and saw that it's real. And I know some really amazing people who have preserved things that I think would make Gerald Gardner absolutely have a heart attack if he were to find out and he was alive. Like he would be like, "What?" Like it's that well preserved. But also, I have to protect that in the way that I talk about it, in the way that I communicate about it. And the trust has been given to me. And similarly with the traditions that are completely foreign to my ancestry, I feel immense privilege to have learned it and to have carried it. And I've strived so hard to learn the right languages and to really be present as a guest, yes, but also as one. Initiation grants you a borrowed authority. This is something that my godfather often says. It is not immediately you earn it. You're just given it because that's what a start is. That's what initiation is. Then you earn it over time by showing up and by continually being there, by continually being present, and by being watched by the spirits of the lineage too. And so I'm happy for you, and I'm so glad that you get to have this increased confidence now. You our third co-host, Salt, is someone who's also British, and he's notoriously humble about the fact that he's super smart and really good at everything he does. But like one of the things that I notice about that kind of attitude is there's a real importance to that humility. I think that we all carry in the sense of knowing that it is a privilege to be able to inherit this and to be given that trust. It is not a right. And so we exert with every action, not just magical actions, not just the way that we talk about things, but with our character in everyday mundane situations, that we are able to bear it. And so I think that is something that is exceptionally special about being initiated to different systems and something that is especially beautiful about joining a tradition that is not necessarily from your own culture. But even within your culture, you may come from a family that isn't yours, right? Like it's not like a family tradition that where like your grandmother teaches you something. It could be like in my case, it's from a completely different family. And so even though I do in my ancestry have, people who have taught me in my dreams and through possession as spirits, as ancestors who have guided me from a very young age, like those who really taught me a lot of what I know are not related to me, And so even there you're a guest, right? So it's that is what animism is to me as like a hashtag, I suppose. It is knowing that you're always a guest, outside of your home, every crossroads, every forest, every river, every mountain belongs to other spirits. When you walk through them, that simple acknowledgement that like I am not at my home, I'm in someone else's home that is existing and watching and knows this area and the literal animals and spirits gossip to those spirits, back and forth and keep each other completely abreast of like, oh, she was here harvesting mugwort again, that kind of thing. Like, oh, she left bread and honey, good, that kind of thing. Like that is always living in my mind. And I think that is really what it means to observe why the plant folklore came to be the way it is in the first place. It's through observation of that they are their own beings, they are their own agents with their own personas, and we are guests in their world.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so, so, so much, Albert. This was absolutely stimulating. You are, as always, a joy. And I'm so, so excited to hopefully have you back on in the future to talk all other sorts of things. I know there's like a gazillion topics we could cover, but thank you so much for sharing.
It's been, yeah, this has been lovely. I'm very honored to be because I listening to previous episodes and then hearing the caliber. I'm like, I feel very happy that I'm deemed worthy to be spoken to.
Oh,
But no, it's lovely. I would be so happy to come back.
yes, absolutely.
I would love to have you. It was our pleasure.
Indeed, indeed. And we have a little tradition. As you can tell, we are very like loose sometimes, very tongue-in-cheek.
Nasty.
Very mindful, very demure, very brat summer, where we try and keep the caliber of the conversation very high, but we also like our little lowbrow, enjoyment. And so we have this thing of Akashic Records because we had like so many ideas what the podcast could be called. Like I really wanted to be like Live, Laugh, Left Hand Path at some point, and or like the fourth podcast of occult philosophy, or like that. We had so many memes, and mercifully a much better one won. Our title comes from the Grand Grimoire, but we do have our Akashic Records, which are our songs, and mine for this time around, because however you feel about them, I stand them. Okay, is Naruto from Heilung, because I do fuck with that concert. That was great. They were great live, and I fuck with little world music. That is like everyone thinks is like, oh my god, this is ancient Viking battle trance, yes, even though it has like literal Tibetan instruments. I love a little world music, shamanism aesthetic, because it's fun, and honestly, one of my favorite Serbian equivalents of Artra does kind of the same thing. And I fuck with it in the way that my friend fucks with kitschy Egyptian mugs.
If anything, Heilung puts on a fantastic live show.
I know, because you fucking berserker tranced out in there. And nearly put your fist through somebody else's face. And that gets the key seal of approval for a good concert.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. It was like playing Alfred Haiti and you were like ready to fucking jump on stage. You would not have looked out of place, sir.
Yeah, would have worked out.
And Albert, you have a song for us too.
Yeah. I chose Carl and Mikla. They're like a synthy, like witchy synth band here.
Yes.
They're all lovely, brilliant. And the song I've chosen is Örlögin, which means like fate, the fate.
Hell yeah. And I like how you have an entire boiler room performance.
Yeah, JFDR's Boiler Room Reykjavik live performance is my perennial recommendation for any music coming out of Iceland.
I love it. I love it. Well,
she's lovely also, by the way.
Yeah,
It's a very small place. She's really lovely.
When we were setting up for the episode, I was like, here's my Akashic Records for today. And then Albert's like, oh yeah, lovely, lovely people. And I enjoyed talking to them. And I'm like, everyone knows everyone. Okay.
It really is, like, honestly.
Oh my god, that's awesome. Amazing. And your suggestion for our lessons to depart was none other than the Hail Mary in Icelandic, which perfect, I think, choice given everything we talked about. Let's get a little Mary Freya going on.
Hail sértu María, full náðar, Drottinn er með þér. Blessaður ert þú meðal kvenna og blessaður er ávöxtur lífs þíns, Jesús. Heilaga María, Guðs móðir, bíð þú fyrir oss syndugum, vonum þú og á dauðstundu vori. Amen.
This is so sweet.